So this is our third in a sermon series that I've been doing called The Questions That God Asks, and we've been in Genesis, and I got to tell you, I hope that you're enjoying it as much as I am and getting as much out of it. There's something about these stories that every time I read them, I have new insight, and so that's certainly true of this one. Today we're talking about Cain and Abel. God asks a question, and it's answered with a question. Where is your brother is answered with, am I my brother's keeper? Cain is the oldest brother, Abel is the youngest. We read that Abel raised cattle and Cain worked the field. In time, they both grow up. At some point, they go to make an offering to God. Cain brings some of his fruits, and Abel brings some fat portions of the animals he's raised. And for some reason that we're really not sure of, God honors and accepts Abel's offering, but doesn't honor and accept Cain's. Why is this? Why did God accept one offering and not the other? The text really isn't clear, so if you were reading along with Carolyn and you couldn't quite figure that out, you are not in bad company. A lot of people have wondered about this question throughout the ages. One explanation is that Abel's offering was a blood offering, and so God wanted blood in the sacrifice. But I don't really buy that one. The text never says that. God doesn't say beforehand, hey, make sure if you happen to bring an offering to me, it's a blood sacrifice. Probably the most common explanation that I've ever heard might be the same one that you've heard before, is that Cain did not bring his best fruits, but Abel brought his best fruits. I see some of you nodding. Because the text says that he brought fat portions from the firstborn. So these interpreters argue, well, Abel must have thought through his gift. And then it also says Cain brought some fruit. And so they say, well, it's just some. He didn't really take any care into he didn't bring the best fruit, he just brought some. It seems like a good explanation. It seems like it makes sense. It helps a person sleep at night. And it preaches, right? I could stand up here and say, so this text is telling us, bring the best before God. Although I think it's very flimsy. It's all based on that word some. Oh, look, Cain just brought some fruit. The truth is, we really just don't know. We don't know why God accepted Abel's offering and not Cain's. I personally favor another explanation that was offered by rabbis a long time ago when they were trying to make sense of this verse. And the explanation is this. There's really not a reason, or at least there's not a reason that we can know. And that's okay. God is free to do whatever God thinks is best, not because God is cruel, but because God's ways are not our ways. We don't always understand, nor do we have to understand why God does what God does, or why life works the way it does. Blessings don't always line up with merit. Sometimes you work very hard for the job and someone else gets the promotion. Sometimes one family suffers disaster while another family doesn't. The person who goes to church all their lives, gives to the church, volunteers at church, serves on all the committees, sometimes receives the unfavorable diagnosis, while the person who seems very carefree with their health or with their faith walks away untouched. That's just something that we all know. So the rabbis remind us of something that we already know. We don't control our lives. We don't always understand the things that happen. And so if you think about that, you can put yourself in Cain's situation. Cain is like us. He feels mistreated maybe. He doesn't understand. He feels confused and hurt. And then for one reason or another, whether it's because of blind rage, because he was angry at his brother or angry at himself, or because he was angry at God, he rises up against Cain and kills him. And God asked Cain, "Where is your brother?" I want to share with you what I feel is the most interesting translation problem in the Bible. So if you carry a Bible with you, or if you have a notebook or something, you want to write this down, I think this is just really cool. So this is what we read after God asked Cain, after God talks to Cain and Abel about their sacrifices. We read, this is verse 8. Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let us go out into the field." And when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. But it doesn't really say that. In fact, what it says is, Cain said to his brother Abel, and then it just stops. And it never says what Cain said. And then it says they went out into the field. I think that's really interesting. What exactly did Cain say? Now, translators try to help us here, because you can't really say that in English, like just stop talking. And so they say, well, Cain must have said, "Hey, let's go out into the field." And so translators add that phrase in there. But that phrase is not in there. And that has led some translators to think it would be better to say, Cain said to his brother, ... Some translators have even suggested Cain spoke with his brother Abel. But that's not really right either, because when you say you spoke to somebody, in English at least, it kind of implies that y'all spoke together. But we never get that. In fact, the implication is that Abel didn't say anything. What I'm getting at is that a lot of Old Testament scholars think that what's happening here, or at least it seems possible, that Cain, confused and angry, feeling alone and rejected, just needed someone to talk to. So he sought out comfort in the person who knew him best. And Abel did not listen to him. It could be that Cain tried to talk to Abel about his frustrations, and Abel just neglected his brother. Maybe it's that the text doesn't report the words that Cain said because those words were never heard. They just fell on a deaf ear. Now, make no mistake, the story makes it clear. Cain should not have killed his brother Abel. And if the story doesn't make that clear, I hope that we can all agree on that. Like, you should not kill. Violence is never the answer. In fact, Elie Wiesel, the Holocaust survivor and author, says, the story of Cain and Abel makes it clear he who kills his brother. Cain introduced murder into the world, and there's no excuse for it. Cain bears full responsibility for his act of violence. But the silence in the text invites us to wonder, was there a failure on Abel's part also? Two tragedies side by side, the sin of violence and the sin of neglect. It might be that Abel, riding high on the clouds, happy of himself, he thinks, I'm right, I'm on God's side, God favored me. Maybe it was just beneath him to listen to his brother. Maybe he felt that if he called God unfair, that then he would have to say, well, God was unfair to me also. Maybe my offering wasn't as good as it should have been. I'm really not sure, and I can't tell you that that's actually what's happening in the text. But I can tell you that I think that's what's happening because that's what happens. It's what happens in the human story. It's what happens in our story. We too often neglect our brothers or our sisters because they say things we don't want to hear. We too often don't want to console each other because we fear that somehow that's going to bring us down. It just seems true to the human condition that we don't like to listen. Maybe we feel if we decide that somebody else is right, that means we must be wrong, and we don't want to hear that. We misconstrue words, we shout over each other, we mischaracterize one another in how we want to see them and not who they really are. For many of you, last week was the first time that you ever heard of Charlie Kirk. If you don't know, you probably know by now, Charlie Kirk was a conservative internet influencer, and what that means is he talked on an internet platform and had a lot of followers. You might think, if you don't know what that is still, you might think like a radio talk show host. As many of you know, Mr. Kirk was shot and killed last week at a rally that he was giving on a college campus. And it was certainly a tragedy of political violence. But there was another tragedy concerning his death, and that's how people reacted to it. It immediately became politicized. Both sides were horrified by this. Don't be confused by that. Both sides called this out as something that shouldn't happen, as a horrific act. But that didn't unite us. Instead of listening to our shared grief, we immediately started saying that the other side wasn't as sorry as they should be, or maybe the other side was even happy that this happened. It also became of great importance what the motives of the killer was. If you don't know, some immediately claimed that this was a person on the left. He was a radical liberal. But once the person was caught, there was a little bit of evidence there. Maybe you could look at it just a certain way and say that no, this person was actually on the right, and so the left touted this as a victory. Another group, the anti-trans community, said that at one point in his life, he probably knew or interacted with a transgendered person, and so that must be the reason for the violence. And you can hear God say, "Where is your brother?" And we answer, "Oh, I'm not my brother's keeper." Grief is a very strong tool. I don't want to waste it on uniting us when I can build up my own side. Another act of political violence occurred only a few short months ago when John Hoffman, a state senator in Minnesota, and Melissa Hortman, a former state representative in the House of Representatives, and they were both gunned down in their homes. Senator Hoffman and his wife Yvette were badly wounded but not killed. Representative Hortman and her husband Mark were both killed. It was a coordinated act of political violence. It targeted this time people on the other side of the political spectrum. But again, the shootings immediately came politicized. Instead of mourning together, we divided. Some downplayed the shootings as isolated incidents, while others used them as proof that all conservatives must be very dangerous. Both sides demanded to know the ideology of the killer, so again they could assign blame. And again, God asks, "Where is your brother?" And again, we dodge. I can't be my brother's keeper right now. There's just too many political points to score. On that same day of Charlie Kirk's shooting, many of you know that there was another shooting that took place in a Colorado school where 2 children were shot. You know, I remember when these shootings used to happen, maybe even right before church or maybe on Saturday, and we'd have like a moment of silence in church because it was so horrific and it never happened before. And now these things just happen so often, you can't even keep count of them. But again, instead of grieving for children and parents and teachers whose lives are changed forever, we rush to our corners. Some argue that this is proof we need stricter gun laws. Others say this is proof we need more armed security. Some blame broken families. Some blame video games. Some blame mental health. And all the while, the names and faces of children fade behind the debate. And I think you can hear God say, "Where is your brother?" And we keep answering, "I'm not my brother's keeper. I only care for those who think like me," which is another way of saying, I only care for myself. I'm going to share something with you on a very personal note. Maybe you can tell from how I'm talking, I'm getting very discouraged. There's just so much name calling. There's so much refusal to listen. There's so much anger, so much violence, so much mischaracterization. In fact, last week I talked with a family member who confided in me. She told me that she was very disappointed in humanity. She said she was very disappointed in her own political party. She said, but mostly I'm very disappointed in Christians and in my church. She said that she felt like they were just buying into the hate. I told her I understood, and I was very much in the same boat. But I said, we need to remember that's not what Christianity is. That's not what Christ taught. Christ said in Matthew 5:21 through 22, if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you will be guilty to the court. And if you say, you fool, you will be facing the fire of hell. I can't even call somebody an idiot? Why, that's like the number one word used on Facebook today. Later in that same chapter, he says, you have heard it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. That's what Jesus said, and that's what we are called to live. Last week, I made an offhand comment that I thought the debate was stupid. And in fact, more than one of you had commented on it and brought that to my attention. So if you think you were alone in that, by the way, you weren't. And I explained, I said, to me, when we debate, we pick sides. We teach our kids from a very early age. You either win or lose an argument. And if you lose any part of an argument, then you lose, and you are a loser. You don't change your mind when new information is presented. You just look to see how you can incorporate it into what you previously thought. You don't listen to people to understand, you listen to win. And I wonder what would happen if instead of teaching debate in schools, we taught dialogue. If we taught children how to speak to, and more importantly, to listen to one another, to empathize with one another, or to incorporate one another's lives into our own. Cain chose violence instead of dialogue. Abel possibly chose silence instead of dialogue. And we today as humanity just keep repeating the same things. You know, I almost didn't include this question in my sermon series of the questions that God asks, because it really isn't a question at all. It's an answer. It's an answer to Cain's question. Cain asked, am I my brother's keeper? And God says, yeah, you are. In fact, you can actually translate this a different way. And a way that many scholars think is probably better to the story, and that includes me. You could translate it not as a question at all, but that Cain answers with a statement, and he says, I didn't know I was my brother's keeper. With that understanding, we might look at God's question in a different way. God is saying, hey, just in case you didn't know, just in case you haven't thought about it, you are your brother's keeper. You keep them with your words, always speaking gently and lifting one another up. You keep them with your listening, always humbling yourself to a greater understanding. And most importantly, you keep them with your love, always thinking of yourself as a servant to all, as Jesus was a servant to all. Let's pray. Lord God, I would say we're at a special part in human history with disagreement, but it's gone on throughout human history. People disagree, people refuse to listen, people kill each other over disagreements and only use that violence to score political points. God, help us as your church. Help us to look to you for our answers, not to our political leaders, not to our favorite internet site or YouTube video, but help us to look to you and to your word so that we might truly be united. We might truly be the disciples that Jesus has called us to be. Amen.